Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Dr. Rukhsana Chaudhry, and I am presenting today on religious-based anti-bullying interventions and programming in the U.S. And I do want to give a little background about myself. I'm the Director of Mental Health Programming for the American Muslim Health Professionals, and I currently teach clinical psychology at the George Washington University, and I run a clinic that is trauma-focused work for women and families who are seeking asylum. So a lot of my work has been in the area of trauma, but recently for the American Muslim Health Professionals, I have moved into work focusing on youth. And in the last few years, we have seen a rise in issues related to religious-based bullying. And so today I wanted to present on what we have found through our work through American Muslim Health Professionals, through partnerships, and working on a white paper as well that discussed our recent summit. That was an interfaith summit that discussed how to best address religious-based bullying in our schools from the parent perspective, student perspective, and practitioners. So right away, I'd just like to go over the prevalence of this issue and how we address that. So the US Department of Education has put out through Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that we're not required to record a target's religion, though it may be inferred based on ancestry or ethnic origin. And this does pose a dilemma in trying to address religious-based bullying. At the same time, 1% of, it's been reported that 1% of 12 to 18-year-olds have become the targets of religious-based issues, religious-based hateful speech and issues of discrimination in the US. And this is a very, very low number. So what we have found through our reporting and our own summation through our work on an interfaith summit addressing religious-based bullying is that there's a lot of inadequate reporting right now, and there's a lack of training in schools. And that's on the definition of what actual bullying is. And so the failure to report these issues is causing a fear of retaliation and belief that adults in schools will have nothing to do, won't be able to address the incident. And so this causes a mental health issue as well, in that when children don't feel a sense of safety in an environment, that can pose a problem in how they interact with their peers and how they go about resolving anything that they're feeling internally. So some of the key issues that we can talk about here is that, you know, the idea of bullying does vary from state to state. We require a lot of more forward thinking on this issue and defining it. The New Jersey Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights is one of the most advanced definitions, and I think very useful. They include the use of harassment, intimidation, and bullying. They also include the idea that a single or a series of incidents would be something that schools are required to respond to. And the law does note vulnerable people. So and vulnerable groups. One of the things that we would recommend as we move forward on addressing religious-based bullying in the United States is being able to address who's more at risk, and something we will talk about later in this presentation. So in a study conducted by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding on a nationally representative sample of American families, 42% of Muslims, 23% of Jews, and 6% of Catholics reported that at least one child had been bullied in the past year because of their religion. So this is so important in that our own community is reporting such a high rate of bullying, and it's directly connected to their faith. So, you know, the national statistic is more closer to 30%, but ours, 25 to 30%, but our community is dealing with this at a much higher level. So 25% of the cases involves Muslim students, teachers, or an administrator that is perpetuating the bullying. And that's something to be aware of in our community, that it's not always the students that are really perpetuating ideas about Muslim students. It's adults, and it's the role models that are often involved in one school setting. So a report by CARE also found that 50% of California Muslim students are aged, between the ages of 11 to 18, are being reported that are reporting that they are being called mean names about their religion. So other means of bullying also include social exclusion and fear of being bullied again. So something that you might see in the mental health aspect of what happens when someone is bullied is there's always an underlying fear that this will continue, that it won't end. And when people feel and experience that can turn into abuse and there's no cavalry coming, there's no sense that there's an end to it, this can put young students on a path of significant depression. So it's important that when it goes on and on and on, to understand that there's continued fear, that's like being in a chronic state of stress. So learning from testimonies is something that's very important when it comes to religious-based bullying and what we might see in our own community, in that in our National Interfaith Summit, which I am also summarizing here, we conducted this summit in December of 2017, just in this past year. And we partnered with interfaith partners to discuss these issues and the effects of religious-based bullying. Some of the stories that were shared at our summit portrayed the negative mental health outcomes that are associated with being a target of bullying. One of our main speakers spoke about the feeling of disempowerment as a Hindu American, leading him to develop obsessive compulsive disorder as an adult. Another story was told through the eyes of a young Sikh male, and he described bullying leading him to becoming a bully himself, which is not uncommon. Oftentimes, a bullying experience as a young child can turn into wanting to be the aggressor or trying to reverse that in some way. And ultimately, they are not immune either from depression. And this particular victim had talked about his depression and bipolar disorder he later developed. So with regards to the target or the victim of abuse, several correlates have been found in literature, including anxiety and depression, compromised peer relationships, and academic disengagement, and at the most severe, a risk of suicide. Some solutions in terms of this area is through our own work and through our summit, we have found is taking a whole school approach, infusing anti-bullying messages and strategies on a systemic level. So that means you're not just talking about anti-bullying from peer to peer and student to student in terms of conflict resolution. It has to be understood in the context of the student's life experience at school. So does it address issues related to bullying in a curriculum? Does it address classroom practices? Does it address differences and how to better understand our differences, which is a fundamental aspect of religious-based bullying, as opposed to presenting it as just a separate assembly or just a conflict resolution experience with two people. Anti-bullying messages and strategies have to be employed by the entire school, and they must be linked to life skills learning. Students need to be asked, how are you helping this school community thrive? And if they are not asked that in the positive sense, the idea that they would ever intervene in a bullying scenario is kind of too far away from the mentality of how you'd like to see a school change, or to ask them to be more upstanders versus bystanders. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. It's also intertwined with the school's commitment to instruct and promote social, emotional character development. And that has to do with all those life skills like self-awareness, self-management, social awareness. So we want children to develop more confidence in social skills to become upstanders as opposed to bystanders. The upstander is somebody who can call out a scenario and name it, label it, and not even to have to do that in a public situation if that's what is asked for. They might have to do it in other ways, by talking to a teacher, by maybe even talking to another student about what they saw and and having uncomfortable feelings with it. So, there's all kinds of ways to be upstanders, and it doesn't always have to, put an enormous amount of pressure on a student. And bystanders, something they found through a bystander scenario is that they are often also victims of bullying because they are learning the same stereotypes and ideas about a person's faith that the bully themselves is perpetuating. So they are also absorbing those messages, which essentially is another form of being victimized. So some of the solutions that we've also understood to be very helpful is, beyond gathering data on the climate, we want to have programming that addresses belonging and social isolation, as we discussed at our summit. Taking a developmental perspective on this is really important. So identity is a huge component on why religious-based bullying occurs. All of these children in these age groups, 11 to 18, 12 to 18, they are really struggling with that sense of identity. This is one of the primary stages of identity development, as according to one of our foremost thinkers on identity development for adolescents, Erik Erikson. So we do know that this is one of the most important stages. So why investigate differences at this age? Because it helps children understand who they are and to understand where their place is. Suzanne Greenfield talked about this in addressing the school climate and inclusion issue, where she said that with regards to assessment of school climate, schools can access the National School Climate Survey. And so that's one aspect of importance, that a school is actually assessing themselves. Another question to be posed, something we saw from Barbara Sawhill, who is a presenter at our summit, was to understand how much that people see themselves in the curriculum. Is there a reflection of a Muslim role model? Is there a reflection of a Sikh role model? Do they understand that there are many, many different types of people to look to as role models, or to understand the development of nation states and how that has to do with religion? So in terms of solutions for teachers, we've talked about this in different forums in the past year. And one of the things we have found is that identity and self-exploration exercises have a lot to do with how teachers learn to talk to their students. And so in terms of their own identity and cultural backgrounds, this is an important aspect that teachers can get involved in. They can talk about themselves and their backgrounds and explore it with their colleagues. And this develops a model for developing empathy. So another aspect of teacher-specific teaching style or classroom environment is cultural competency and training. This is a very important aspect of school environments and something that every classroom must reflect. Class-based stereotype awareness and challenging skills through their own religious literacy training is an absolutely imperative part for teachers to utilize. Testimonies and accounts revealed targets of religious-based bullying were most impacted by psychologically and emotionally, where there was an inaction by adults, or religious stereotypes or derogatory terminology was perpetuated by adults. So again, when a role model or a primary person in one's life that is an adult, and if it's in the setting of a school, is giving messages that have to do with misinformation about faith, religion, or culture, a lot of students can take that as fact. And that is a very important aspect of how religious-based bullying continues today in our environment. You know, oftentimes it occurs in a peer setting, but that lack of acknowledgement, that lack of labeling, and that lack of understanding that might come from someone who is older that one might look up to creates a problem in the student's mind, because they're wondering why it's not being corrected, and if it's not, it could be the truth. So educators or administrators also can benefit from a lot of this school climate understanding, and also the social emotional character development and building competencies. They also are the ones responsible for addressing systemic change that address bullying in more than just the victim's experience, just the bully's experience, but the entire school level's cultural competency aspect, and how the school level addressed religious-based bullying as an issue. If a school doesn't address themselves as a whole, there is a sense that these are isolated incidents and that they won't happen again. But we really can't look at religious-based bullying as something that won't happen again. In our environment, we see it, we absorb messages from all around us, and so we can assume that they will be found in a school setting. Incorporate anti-bullying initiatives into the school-based life skills learning. Ensure that a student's ability to participate and thrive within the school community has some kind of incentive, and it must include a focus on anti-bullying work. So, and teachers and educators and administrators alike also can continue this process of recognition, acceptance of differences in their work. One of the most important things is to connect parents to the school culture and provide them with opportunities to share information about their holidays, and important faith-based dates. This is something that a lot of schools are trying to do and are already doing better with. But even at, you know, some of the I think most highly staffed schools where they have a high teacher-student ratio, they still struggle to understand how to better address, faith-based dates, holy days, how to properly incorporate a student's experience, like our holy month of Ramadan. And, there's also sometimes a fear that they may say something wrong. So there's something about the parents that can add to that. That's a very important element. An example of this would be establishing a teacher and student-led team focused on inclusion of parents who may have cultural barriers to understand the steps necessary to take if a child is targeted based on faith or religion. So sometimes parents really need a hand to be held out to them, especially if they've recently migrated or there are significant cultural language barriers. And students are oftentimes the most valuable in being able to help adults along. And it's part of our, I think our drive to not underestimate how powerful students are. So if you establish a team that's also made up of students to do that kind of connecting, that can be very powerful for them as life skills learning, and also for the teachers who may fear stepping on someone's toes or not really knowing enough. And it gives them a kind of more of a community feeling. Students also, in terms of their solutions, can benefit from religious literacy training, as we know. This is a really important aspect to combating stereotypes. They often need to be seen in terms of how they can learn from these experiences. So a focus on religious-based bullying and how that connects to missed opportunities to challenge bias as part of a student's learning is really critical. Incentives to challenge biases are very important. They need to be experiencing some validation when they are able to challenge a stereotype effectively. A recognition of students for their courage to speak out. This is something that a lot of bullying programs, anti-bullying programs have started to use, and is, it's a different kind of rewarding. It's more about the courage. It's more about being able to say, I experienced it, or I'm willing to help others who experience it. Restorative justice is also an important aspect where there's a bully, a target, and bystanders, and they are able to talk through and discuss what was underlying their experiences at the time. Practitioners also are recommended to really assess the mental health outcomes of every person that experiences religious-based bullying, and to not overlook that it is not bullying, that it is an important aspect that they know religious-based bullying is a form of bullying, and it's really seen in the form of bias-based bullying. Practitioners should note that one's faith may be experienced, the ongoing bullying of one's faith may be experienced as a form of abuse, and it can become really significant in the identity development of an individual, both for the bully and the target. Social factors such as loneliness and social isolation at home and in the community should be explored for both the target and the bully. Parents also are really encouraged to utilize available resources. So this is in part of the movement that has to do with digital, being a responsible digital citizen, but children really can't, and young adults can't really be aware of that responsibility unless parents are understanding how to address cyberbullying. So some of that has to do with knowing the laws and the policies, but also having parents understand what being responsible online means. It's important they foster a relationship with school, and also that they inform themselves about their vulnerability, their child's vulnerability, as part of a certain faith group. School reporting also needs to kind of be refined in that, there are a lot of different, there's a lot of different mechanisms to report, but a lot of students do want an anonymous way to report what they see and what they hear. Some social media channels that are anonymous, which are very helpful for students, are called After School or Seven Cups. These are platforms where no one's name is used. And it takes out that element of fear of retaliation if you do become aware of a situation and feel that you might be a snitch. This becomes anonymous. So I wrote this question here about recently migrated families or non-English speaking families. It's very important that they do receive some kind of seminar, whether through an interpreter, about what being online does to students as they become older. What are the kind of platforms they're on? What are things, how do they know if their child is vulnerable? Susan Greenfield, who we had at our summit, also talked about schools making an effort to ensure that a child will not be harmed because of reporting. Building parent-school community partnerships are also critical to the most important anti-bullying, effective anti-bullying programs. And, you know, that's because children may not report such incidents to their parents. So if the parent is out of the picture and really doesn't understand the school environment, and there's very little communication, this type of ongoing experience can result in that abusive experience, because there's very little ways to stop it when there is a lack of communication. Community and global solutions. Some of the things we talked about here was online bullying in the real world and how that kind of comes together. And sometimes that cyberbullying that you might see does enter the school, and it can really create a kind of pressure cooker for anyone who's experiencing the bullying, because it's both in the online world and it's the school environment. So then these online negative interactions become real, they become live. And it's important for parents to understand how that works, and that they go back to understanding the governing of cyberbullying, and that it is a way of bullying. One of the organizations that I'd recommend looking at, just if you are interested in working in this or helping students, is the Council of People's Organization, and they are out of New York. And they've really found a way, and they came to our summit to talk about the Muslim, Arab, South Asian community in a way that gives back to their community. And we really found them to be a great model for youth as a youth empowerment program. They have one program like Halal Meals on Wheels, and provision of support for immigrants, and the Alternative to Violence Project. So it's really important to know how to give students options to become upstanders. Other important points as I come to a conclusion to this presentation to understand for American Muslim students, and this is taken partially from different areas that the Family and Youth Institute has talked about, but that there's a lot of things that teachers can use to address anti-Muslim sentiment that includes that anti-bias learning environment. So how do experiences, perspectives, and words of Muslim people into the curriculum, you know, incorporating them into the curriculum through social studies and current events and instruction and children's literature, how does that actually lead to reduced anti-religious bullying, based bullying? And that is through children understanding that there is something else that they may not know. So there's always a sense that when you hear stereotypes, that that's the truth. But one way to deal with that is to offer alternative ideas, alternative explanations. So when you teach about world religions, you want to make sure to include Islam. And of course, when there's slurs or insults, there needs to be direct and quick intervention. So they also have talked about this challenging bias language and as an intervention and deconstructing bias and stereotypes. So we often encourage students to learn how to be an ally when faced with bias or bullying. And this actually goes to the same concept of becoming an upstander. But being an ally also can be in the form of a peer mentor. And a lot of schools are trying to develop a program where mentorship from students can be the real place that students go to begin to discuss religious-based bullying and how that impacts their mental health. Here are some resources that I wanted to put up. The U.S. Department of Education and their letter on harassment, and also a summary of laws and policies, and different translations of those letters on harassment and bullying. Finally, what's important to know is that progress is needed to improve our definition, measurement, and reporting of this form of victimization. Without also recording the ethnic and racial stereotypes, we will continue to underestimate the prevalent form of this abuse. And in order to understand this form of bias-based bullying, we can no longer conflate race, ethnicity, and religion, unless we will be remiss to know how frequently this type of bullying occurs. So it's always going to be a consistent question as to how religious-based bullying also relates to race and ethnicity. And until we really try to address that by recording those events, we will still not have the necessary data that we need. So it is important that we push our communities, push our school boards, push our schools to include this information in their reporting. And to close, I just wanted to end with this because it can really seem like a big task to do this work and to try to change our own communities and our family our family environments and also schools. But Rumi reminds us that out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. And I love this poem because it's such an important aspect of understanding how we are all in this together. And if we do go back to that in understanding why we want to take care of this issue for our own community and others, as we did through our summit, we end up in a better place. So I'll close there.